Hey folks, George here. Today we're going to start a series of videos on the question of the ethics around war. What is a just war? Can war ever be justified, ethically speaking? Today's article, we're going to visit Douglas P. Lackey in his 1989 article, Pacifism. Now, Lackey starts his article by suggesting if pacifism is a very real moral theory, then it must be prescribed for all or for none, right? That is, there's an interesting aspect of morality and ethics that Lackey is exploiting here, and that is to say that ethics is universalizing. Otherwise, you're not really talking about ethics, are you? Then you're just talking about tastes. Let's talk about a couple of competing claims here, right? For example, I might say cookies and cream ice cream is bad. Or I might say serial killers or serial killing is bad, right? One is radically different in the nature of the claim from the other. Yes, one seems to be talking the claim about ice cream, and the ice cream that I think is bad seems to be a claim about my taste. But when I say serial killing is bad, I'm saying it's bad for everybody. And if you are a serial killer, then yes, I'm saying you are bad, regardless of your tastes. Yes? So that's why Lackey suggests that pacifism has to be a universalizing sort of moral theory, if it's any moral theory at all. Lackey starts his article about pacifism by describing four different kinds of pacifism, right? First, he says that the central idea of pacifism is the immorality of killing. That's one type of pacifism, one that just claims the immorality of killing. The second type of pacifism is one that says there's an immorality about violence. Violence in general is immoral, according to the second type of pacifism. The third type of pacifism says that personal violence is always wrong. However, political violence might be acceptable. Then there's the fourth type of pacifism that's going to say that political violence is always wrong, but sometimes personal violence is acceptable. Yes? He goes back to what might be the roots of these pacifist inclinations, right? And he goes all the way back, one example he starts with is the Bible, yes? In Exodus 20:13, one of the 10 Commandments is, "Thou shalt not kill." The first criticism is to suggest that, wait a second, a better translation of that claim, "thou shalt not kill," is merely, "thou shalt not murder." And that is expressed in Exodus 22:18 and Leviticus 24:16. Thou shalt not murder seems slightly different from thou shalt not kill. Yes? Furthermore, how do we actually know that the Bible is God's word? It's clearly written by people, and if you're not exactly a believer, then you're not going to be convinced that this Bible is so authoritative, right? He also asks, are these laws only for the Israelites, or are they for all humans, right? And then, of course, what about the claim that there might not be a God at all, right? There's a number of philosophy of religion texts that you could explore and examine that will tackle that question, yes? What else might be the root of this pacifist inclination? Well, Lackey suggests this idea that's been tossed around, that all human life is sacred. Therefore, killing is wrong, right? And by the way, even non-pacifists are going to suggest that killing is a revolting behavior. Killing is a revolting action, right? Nobody wants to kill, even those people who support killing in very specific circumstances, right? Really, what Lackey is trying to throw out here is a couple of problems with this pacifist position. Number one, his first problem that he gives us is, what if killing many people saves even more lives? That's just a classic utilitarian style argument. What if I kill this person in order to save lots of other lives? would killing still be wrong? Right? Now, that's a complicated question, of course. Philosophers and ethicists wrestle with those kinds of questions all the time and have for many, 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 many years. Now, why is this problem of killing one person to save many? Why is that a problem for the pacifist who says all life is sacred, therefore killing is wrong? Well, if all life is sacred, doesn't that entail that we might have to kill some people to save more lives, right? After all, what does all life is sacred really mean? Does it mean that we should preserve all lives, or does it mean that we should preserve as many lives as possible? I'm not sure. And Lackey is illustrating this complicated problem here, yes? There's a further problem with this claim that all life is sacred. If all life is sacred, doesn't that mean that all risky behavior is therefore morally wrong? That is, rock climbing, race car driving, things like that. Martyrdom, even. Sacrificing yourself for the greater cause, let's say. Clearly, many of us don't think those things are wrong. And if we don't think that those things are wrong, then there's something amiss with this claim that all life is sacred. So then, what else might ground this pacifist inclination, this pacifist claim? Well, perhaps we've heard of this notion that there's a right to life that we all have. We all have this right to life. If we all have a right to life, then it is never permissible to kill, even to save others. Because after all, rights are those kinds of things that can't be violated, typically speaking, right? That said, I say typically speaking because the logic of rights is rather complicated. Even John Rawls, who argues for rights, suggests that rights can be violated for some greater right to be preserved, let's say, yeah? So it's a very complicated talk to talk about rights. Another problem with talking about rights, about how complicated they are, is what is a right anyway, right? Many people are confused by this notion, and it's not an entirely clear notion to everybody. But whatever else a right might be, it typically implies permission to defend against people who are going to violate that right. If I have the right to life, then I have the right to defend my life. If it doesn't mean that, then what else does right mean? So this seems to suggest that at least self-defense would be permissible. But what about self-defense against killing? And what about if my self-defense entails killing another person? If that's the case, then a right to life cannot imply some sort of pacifist position, according to Lackey. Next, Lackey starts to discuss the notion of anti-war pacifism. This seems odd to Lackey because, after all, the ideas of just war and self-defense are commonly linked. Clearly, if that's the case, then these anti-war pacifists seem to reject that idea that self-defense and just war are linked. Why would an anti-war pacifist be against killing soldiers? Well, they would say that soldiers are humans, and humans have a right to life, and thus killing even soldiers is wrong. This seems to presuppose some sort of deontological ethics. Why? Because they are suggesting that there's some very firm right that cannot be violated. And according to Kant and other deontological philosophers and other philosophers who really push for a theory of rights, you can never violate rights for the greater good. Lackey sees some problems with this kind of anti-war pacifism, however. After all, killing in war seems to be like self-defense. What does that mean? It's kill or be killed on the battlefield, isn't it? However, the anti-war pacifist is going to remind us you do have an alternative. What is that alternative? You could run away. You don't have to kill. You could simply run away. Furthermore, many wars are not like this. Many wars work and are executed through dropping bombs or shooting missiles. It's not mano-a-mano on the battlefield. Perhaps not in the 21st century, according to these anti-war pacifists. Lackey raises another problem, however, with this anti-war pacifism. After all, don't soldiers assume the risk that they will be killed? Thus, somehow in becoming a soldier, you've sort of surrendered your right to life. You've given up your right to life, and you are saying it is okay to kill me. They accept that they might be killed in war. How does the anti-war pacifist respond to this? The anti-war pacifist is going to remind us that most soldiers around the world are not voluntary. Rather, they are drafted. They are forced to be on the battlefield. That seems to suggest that they didn't freely choose to become a soldier, and thus they did not freely assume the risk of being a soldier, and they did not freely give up their right to life. Furthermore, the moral responsibility does not lie on the soldiers who are on the battlefield, most of which the anti-war pacifist will remind us, has already reminded us, were forced to be here. Rather, the real moral responsibility has to be on the leaders, not the soldiers who did not make the choices to wage war. Soldiers in war act, according to the anti-war pacifists, under extreme compulsion. Again, repeating or stating slightly differently what I had stated earlier, which is they're forced to be there. They're forced to give up their right to life. Thus, killing even soldiers, according to the anti-war pacifist, is wrong. The anti-war pacifist, however, is really, I think the crux or the strongest part of their argument is going to lie with the fact that war entails killing many civilians. In any war, a substantial number of civilians will be killed who did not choose the war. They are presumably innocent civilians. This is terribly immoral, and thus war is terribly immoral. However, Lackey raises an interesting problem, or an interesting response to that problem of killing civilians. And this is called the doctrine of double effect. Nobody, or in just wars at least, nobody targets civilians. Rather, they're unavoidable casualties of war, so to speak. Yes, they weren't the intended target, however, right? And that, according to some people who justify war and justify the killing of civilians, they don't justify the killing of civilians. Rather, what they say is that it wasn't the intended target, thus it's not as immoral, right? It's not as immoral when the civilians who die in war are not the intended target. That is called the doctrine of double effect, by the way. The thinker who is going to disagree with such anti-war pacifism is going to say, wait a second, there's plenty of policies, public policies, right, that cause unavoidable deaths also. For example, speed limits. Speed limits. You want to save pedestrians? Really what we should do, Lackey is generous because he says speed limits are a terrible source of deaths, right? Really, what I would say is go a step further. If you really don't want to kill pedestrians, just ban cars altogether. The fact that we have cars in society, however, illustrates that we as a society, and we individuals also, how do you put this nicely? Well, I don't think you can put it nicely, but what it does illustrate is that we people in society accept a certain amount of pedestrian deaths in order to exchange for the convenience of cars. Because if you want to save pedestrians, I've got the answer right now. Ban all cars. But nobody wants to do that. I wonder if you want to do that, right? So the fact that we don't ban cars illustrates that we as a society are willing to make a trade-off. And in the case, since we do allow cars, does that mean that we're responsible for those innocent pedestrian deaths? I don't think any of us would think that that is a reasonable conclusion. Yet, that's what the anti-war pacifist would have us believe. That's what the anti-war pacifist would have us believe if she is to suggest that civilian deaths in war, which are not intended, are unacceptable. We, every day, accept innocent pedestrian deaths by allowing cars. However, the best, I think, anti-war pacifist response to that example of banning cars versus pedestrian deaths is that who decides to allow cars on the street outside? Right? We do. We do. And in a democratic society, that's where we have decided to accept those pedestrian deaths. Even those of us who are pedestrians, who might die, we've accepted this in a democratic society, haven't we? Because we've made that law. However, the civilians who die in war did not choose to wage war. And that's where the anti-war pacifist would say is a difference, a significant difference. Next, Lackey poses a question. Is there a balance between good and evil in war? Here's the problem. Recall that rights, even a right to life, can be overridden sometimes, right? We can override rights that we all have. However, the anti-war pacifist is going to respond and say, fine, sometimes we can override rights, but killing and death is one of those rights that is so ridiculously hard to override. How do you justify killing somebody? That seems to be one of those paramount rights, that right to life, that if it can be overridden, it seems like it's way too demanding. The criteria to override such a right would be way too demanding to almost ever accept it. So the anti-war pacifist would suggest. Furthermore, the anti-war pacifist is going to remind us is that we could very frequently get the benefit of war, right? Or the so-called benefit of war without the war. Perhaps negotiate peace, right? Or negotiate the terms of peace as opposed to killing each other. However, this is a key problem for Lackey, and that is the pacifist has to show us that no war has ever been justified. And the classic paradigmatic example of a just war would be World War II, stopping the Nazis from committing the Holocaust and trying to wage evil across Europe. It seems like if any war is just, that is a just war. But the anti-war pacifist would say, no, we shouldn't have stopped Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. That seems too far-fetched for Lackey. However, the anti-war pacifists do have a response, and that response is this. By the way, counting the number of deaths of counterfactuals is so ridiculously hard and impossible. It's not unreasonable, so says the anti-war pacifist, to ask the question, could we have saved more lives by negotiating with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, for example? The anti-war pacifist is going to say, you can't prove that that is not reasonable or that it could have saved all those dead soldiers and dead civilians' lives. Lackey wraps up the article with this very interesting consideration. Listen. Lackey knows, and the pacifists know, that theirs is a very unpopular position to take. We know that very few people are anti-war pacifists. We know that very few people are going to suggest that World War II and stopping the Nazi invasion and the Nazi conquest of Europe, very few people are going to say that that was unjustified. However, despite the unpopular nature of the pacifist position, the pacifists speak for the innocent dead that were killed by soldiers, even the good soldiers that liberated the nations under Nazi reign. And many of those innocent dead who were killed by even the good soldiers could have been alive today. Maybe not today, but could have lived fuller lives. And much of their argument rests on that consideration of all of the innocent dead that war engenders. See you next time. Bye-bye.